So Jordan Peterson, for those who do not know who he is, has been called one of the most important public intellectuals in America. He's a Canadian clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Toronto, who wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And I guess he became super popular when he started weighing into the kind of called the culture wars that we have in America, where, he was talking, so he said some controversial things about gender and has kind of strident opinions about lots of the kind of far left people on college campuses and kind of far left academia, and has kind of been, I guess you'd call it like a free speech advocate, which I think everybody, personally, I'm stridently believe in free speech, but he, especially for what we're doing, right? And but also has been kind of calls people who are on the far left, calls them Marxists, and people subjecting themselves to postmodern thinking. And I think a lot of people critique the way he uses the term Marxist and postmodern. So there's kind of part of him that's the culture war thing, where he's supported by kind of right-wing elements. But there's also part of him, just as a psychologist, I just came to him because I saw a video on parenting that he did that I thought was fantastic about how, as someone raised by a mother and a single parent, he made this long discussion about kind of the positive masculine traits in parenting for fathers and the importance of kind of physical play with children. And I just thought it was wonderful. So then I watched another video where he's talking to Russell Brand about 12-step programs that I thought was really great, and I learned a lot. And then you go to like the fourth video and he's like, I don't know, screaming about Marxism. You're like, oh God, oh no. But so yeah, the guy's a mixed bag personally, I think. So I'm sure there's people listening right now, they're like, oh my God, I totally dislike Jordan Peterson, and some people that totally love him. And we're not here to praise or promote. It's just he talks a lot about Taoism in his like in his books and in his speeches that are available online. And so I thought, well, okay, if he has such a massive audience of people that are into him, everything he does goes massively viral online, that we should take what we know, which is the Taoist aspects, and say, hey, is this guy promoting something that is in line with the teachings of Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu and Taoist scholars, and most importantly you, Dr. Carl Totten, if he's talking the true Tao, or we should push back and go, look, no, Jordan Peterson, you do not know what this Tao is all about.
And most people who aren't actually educated in classical Taoism, or from a philosophical perspective, or from a more spiritual or practical perspective, in the sense that they've studied Taoist traditions and arts and practice. In other words, it's embedded in who they are, how they think, how they feel, how they process reality. Most people who kind of take a more intellectual take on the Tao tend to be all over the place. They tend to get some of it right, some of it wrong, and whatever kind of, to think about confirmation bias, whatever confirms their biases, they'll highlight that part
and neglect the other,
neglect the other, or not even see the other, not even perceive it. It's not even on their radar. And one of the things about what the Tao really is about is being aware of that, so that we can kind of check ourselves. The Taoist immortals said that the key, Lu Tongpin, one of the 8 immortals, his primary kind of method for growth was what he called turning the light around. Can you perceive yourself as the part of reality? And by being open to and aware of how you are processing reality in terms of how you are receiving and expressing, yin and yang, to that extent, you might say that you are an aware, a wiser human being. And that's very difficult to do, because most people don't really know how to get outside of their heads enough to actually turn the light around and see themselves as they actually are. that's actually one of the really good reasons for going to a therapist and talking every now and then, even if there's nothing, quote, wrong with you. You aren't diagnosable in the DSM, but just to kind of just go every now and then and just have someone else who's been trained as an observer of human behavior to give you some feedback as to how you're thinking, how you're feeling, how you're coming across, to give you a more balanced perspective, I think is healthy.
Okay, well, with that, so here's Jordan Peterson talking about yin and yang.
I told you about this, but we'll go over it just briefly again because it's very important. So this is the Taoist symbol. That symbol is Tao. Tao essentially means meaning, but it also means the way. It means a bunch of things. And Tao, for the Taoist, is what things are made of. It's the underlying reality of things. And for the Taoists, that's more like meaning than it is like material. Or another way you could think about it is more like information than it is like material. And so the Taoists think that experience, you can't say reality because it's not the same conception, that experience is meaningful and that the meaning is the primary reality. And the meaning differentiates itself as it emerges, and it differentiates itself first into masculine and feminine, essentially, into the structure that you use to perceive reality, that's culture. And what it is that you're perceiving, and that's nature. And that it's a lovely conception. It's different than the way people look at the world in the modern world, but it's parallel, and I think it's, if not more useful, it's certainly equally useful, because it helps you understand and articulate elements of your own experience that can't be understood from a framework that has a different underlying structure. So you know that sometimes you're comfortable and that things are going well for you, and you know that sometimes all hell's broken loose and you've fallen through the ice and you're dazed and confused and maybe you won't get up again, and you know that those are two different places and that you'd rather be in the former than the latter. And you also know that there's certain ways that you should act to make sure that you stay where it's comfortable and interesting rather than wandering off to where it's like terrible beyond belief. Now, you could call that in some sense your innate sense of morality. It's a kind of intelligence, but it's deeper than that. And as I said in the other class, the other thing that's lovely about the Taoist interpretation is that it's the interplay between these two things that constantly brings reality forth, and that if you balance them properly, which is the aim of a properly religious life from the Taoist perspective, then you have all the benefits of what you understand and what you're familiar with, order, and then you have the excitement of having one foot in the unknown. And that's a perfect place for human beings to be, because not only do we want to stay with what we are and conserve it if it's good, but we want to continually transform it so that it gets better and better and better.
So it's kind of interesting. You were talking about how it's like the known and unknowns, and sometimes people, unless they're really mired in the Tao, will project their own beliefs onto it and not realize what they don't know. And it's kind of funny. In his speech, he's just saying that we keep to what we know, but also because like the yin and yang explains to us that there's a whole unknown facet to it as well.
Yeah, and some of the things he said there, I think were pretty, right on. This dynamic between yin and yang, and how each one actually has an element of the other, and that dynamic balance between the two is what allows us to kind of process a fuller reality and then extract some meaning from it. He also talked about this interplay between material and experience, and that certainly kind of resonates with me as a Taoist, because Lao Tzu, I think, was really spending a lot of his energy describing the importance of being able to experience things directly, and in contradistinction to kind of what was happening, I think, in China at the time, where there was a lot more, order was trying to be imposed to almost have a framework from which the material and people's communication and relationships with each other could be structured. Yeah, because remember, that was kind of a feudal days, right? Where you had, these are the days of emperors, and the agrarian societies. And so, those who controlled the land and property kind of controlled everything. Who's going to eat and who's not going to eat. And so Taoism became known also as kind of a nature philosophy, right? A nature religion, if you will, because we talk about the seasons of the year and when can you harvest things and how things grow in nature, in the universe. And so I think Lao Tzu's observations about how all of that works together, both in the collective, in the universe, in nature, and also in each individual human being as being a part of that nature, I think is foundational to understanding the practices of the Tao.
I have another clip here where Jordan Peterson talks about order and chaos. He equates order with yang energy, which we see as tends to be seen as like masculine energy, and he sees the yin energy as more chaotic. I think more from the Taoist perspective, in the yin and yang, it's more of not chaos, but like you would have order, and then you would have the kind of naturalness of things, which is not chaotic because there's a natural order that the Taoists posit, right? Mm-hmm. If you lived in a world where you thought that everything was controlled by, say, a god or an authoritarian figure, then you would have order versus chaos, and not necessarily human in place order versus natural order. Mm-hmm. And I think here he's equating yin energy with chaos instead of the fact that there is a natural order to things. Mm-hmm. But let's listen to the man's words and talk about it.
Dominated. So now the yin-yang symbol is interesting for a variety of other reasons too, because the Taoists believe that that symbol represents being. Now, being is not the same thing as objective reality. Being is what you experience as a conscious creature. That's being. And for the Taoists, being is made up of these two elements, order and chaos. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. The reason for that is wherever you go, and whenever you live, and whoever you are, each environment that you're in is composed of things you understand, and things that work the way you expect them to, and things you do not understand, and that can pull the rug out from you at any moment. And so you can say in some sense that these symbolic representations are representations of the most unchanging elements of being. So the most real things, because, a typical modern person will look at this and think, well, those aren't real. It's like, they are real. In fact, they're hyper-real. Because one of the things that defines real is that it's permanent. And it is permanent. No matter where you go, there are things you know and things you don't know. And it doesn't matter who you are. It's permanent. So it's part of the existential landscape of human being. Now, the other thing there's two other things that are quite cool about the yin-yang symbol, and one is that each of the black paisley has a little white dot in it, and the white paisley has a little black dot in it, and the reason for that is the Taoists also recognize quite well that chaos could turn to order at any moment, so a new order can arise out of a chaotic structure. That's a revolution in some sense. But by the same token, if you're in a place that's orderly and predictable, something can happen that casts you into a chaotic situation right away. So there's a dynamic, even though these two things oppose each other in some sense, there's a continual dynamic interplay between them. And then the final thing that's quite interesting about this symbol, and this is a mind-bogglingly brilliant idea, is that, because the Tao also means the way, and the way is the line between the two. And so what that indicates is, this is a brilliant idea, is that the optimal position for a human being isn't in chaos or in order, because if it's too much order, then it's totalitarian, and if it's too much chaos, then it's disgust and fear and emotional pain and depression. So where's the proper place? And the Taoist answer is right on the line, where you have one foot in order so that you're fairly stable, and you have another foot in chaos so that new and interesting and compelling and transforming things are happening to you. And one of the things that you might note is that your nervous system basically tells you when you're there, and the way it tells you is by making you interested in whatever it is that you're engaged in, because the fact that the thing that you're engaged in grips you, which is really an unconscious process, you can't really control that, it's something that happens to you, is because your nervous system, which is actually adapted to the environment of chaos and order, is telling you that if you're engaged and interested, you are in the place where the balance between chaos and order is perfect.
All right, Dr. Totten, your thoughts, chaos and order.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to frame one's understanding of yin and yang, chaos and order. And, you know, is that one way to frame these the dynamic interplay as life as we experience? It probably is. You know, certainly it's one of the ways that some others have done, and clearly Jordan Peterson is doing in this clip. Another way, however, that might provide some another reference point for some meaning is, you know, yin really refers to being more receptive, being open to the possibility of new things, including perhaps the unknown. And then yang is the capacity to then, once we have been recipients of our own perception and perspective, then the capacity for expression of same. So the person of Tao is receptive on one hand, because that's, as human beings, we're always taking things in. All life forms are taking things in, you know, sunlight, water, air, and nutrients, and then expressing that in such a way. But the unique way in which each individual or each organism expresses itself is its Tao. Mm-hmm. That's its way. And it's this interplay between receptivity and expression that is then balanced by each individual's way of expressing that in the world. and it's interesting, you know, that in his perspective, you know, he's framing that as order and chaos. Is there order within chaos? Is there chaos within order? Mm-hmm. I think so. Yes?
Yeah, I think he kind of points that out, where he's pointing out the white dot and the black dot that are within the reverse, you know.
Exactly. See, so that is, I think, a valid way of describing this, you know, particularly I think to a general audience that may not, and so I don't fault him, you know, for doing so. I just want to point out that's not the only frame from which to perceive the Tao.
I mean, with the Tao, I mean, there's infinite frames, right?
And that's why I said it's interesting to see what frame does someone gravitate towards, because that may tell us more about them than about the Tao sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. If your frame that you immediately go into is order versus chaos, yeah, what are you projecting onto the world?
You know, my Taoist teacher, you know, was a Taoist priest from China. He was a Taoist master of Kung Fu and meditation and Qigong and you know, herbs and so many things. You know, he said this one day, which I thought was profound. He said, what a person sees and pursues reveals their true face, their true heart, if you will. And so by observing how a person processes reality, and then as a result of that, how they, you know, in other words, how their yin, how they take it in, and then their yang, how they express themselves, reveals a lot about who they are as a human being.
You know, I've also heard that the best way to find out someone's priorities is to take a look at their bank statement. Right? You know, I do like what he talks about in there about how he's like, you know, our nervous system creates interest when we are confronted by these chaotic elements, because when we are kind of in order and we know what's going to happen throughout the day, you know, we tend to kind of shut off a bit, right? But when something chaotic, something new, something something that shakes things up, immediately our mind gets focused on it, you know, the new and different thing. Now, how we react to that depends on what that thing is,
Right, and a lot is whether or not we perceive it as a potential threat or not.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's going to lead to anxiety, and then perhaps even trigger the autonomic nervous system, right? The stress response. Because if it's a threat to survival, then the sympathetic nervous system, kind of the part that's going to move into fight or flight or freeze, is triggered, and we begin to feel very defensive, and we have a heightened threat response in our physiology. But at the same time, by the way, that causes the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part and the creative part, to narrow. And so because the threat to survival is first, and so we can't actually think that clearly when that's triggered. And that's one of the very important reasons why the Taoists emphasize meditation so much, because if we can modulate that part of our nature better, then the creative part and the thinking, the intelligent part of our brain expands and it comes online, whereas when it's under threat to the system, that part goes offline. I mean, you can actually see that in someone hooked up to instruments in a lab for psychological experiments. Put someone under threat, and their prefrontal cortex, the thinking and creative part, goes right offline.
I've noticed this, that since I developed like a daily meditation habit, that I tend to be a lot less led around by like my emotions and, thrown off by, I guess, what we'd call a chaotic event, or someone says something out of left field that upsets you. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like you have a much more, I guess, Zen-like ability to kind of confront that and to filter it appropriately and to kind of cast it away if it really isn't anything you need to necessarily pay attention to, but instead of your limbic system reacting to it,
Right, the emotional brain, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that was a little bit on Jordan Peterson. Let's see here. There's
very interesting.
Yeah, there's more out there on him in Taoism, and if there's some kind of reaction and people want to hear more about it, we could do it. But if not, we will move on